one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to the Cavs, and a lot of the focus is on two guards, two bigs, and all like historically have teams won like that. The thing to remember is like historically, a lot of teams, there's not a lot of teams that have won without a top 10, like a consensus top 10 player. And
Mhm.
the Cavs, like as good as Donovan is, he's not a consensus top 10 player. The teams that have won with those type of players usually get production from a whole lot of different guys. You surround them with all-star level talent. I think the Cavs have 4 all-star caliber players on their roster. So getting all 4 of those guys to work and managing those personalities, I think that's a different skill set than, we have a hierarchy of 2 super duper stars and everyone else is just falling in line.
It's funny you say that about Donovan Mitchell. I think this is probably the season he came closest to being a consensus top 10 player, because I had
Yeah.
him on my first team All NBA before the injury both nuked his performance, and like then he just wasn't eligible
Yeah,
for it.
and that's part of why I say consensus, because in my mind, like I always think tiers matter so much more than rankings, right? Like there might be 5 top 10 players in the league in any given year, and I definitely think Donovan is in that caliber of guy that can outplay any player in the league in a playoff series. I felt that way about Kyrie Irving back in the day, where people wouldn't have him necessarily as a top 10 player, but we could also see him outplay Steph in multiple finals, right? Like you're of that caliber, but it's still a different thing than when you're that consensus LeBron James type guy, and that takes some adjusting. But I honestly think like he's closer to like a Tatum than Tatum is to a LeBron caliber guy, right? Like Boston won a championship without Tatum really playing that well.
Mhm.
That's not the case for like a Joel Embiid or a Nikola Jokic or a LeBron James and all that. I think from a Cavs standpoint, if they're going to want to contend, it's going to need to look similar to Boston, where if one of the stars doesn't have it, we have other guys that are able to contribute at a star level for a playoff series and help raise the tide and give the team a chance to compete.
I think that's also kind of what I saw from Donovan Mitchell during that injury stretch where you don't have Mobley, you don't have Darius Garland. The stuff he was doing as balancing in terms of being the floor general for everybody else, but also having to carry the offense as a scorer. Even dating back to his time in Utah, I just never seen a balancing act like that from him. And it continued along this trend of, for the most part, the Donovan Mitchell experience in Cleveland for me, and I'm curious how you feel about this, it's exceeded even what my expectations were. And I had pretty low, I was higher on the Cavs last year and we did this than you were. Turns out
Yeah.
I was wrong. Injuries really new to that. But like, so it's exceeded my expectations, just the Donovan Mitchell experience in Cleveland.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely exceeded mine. I was not incredibly high on Donovan Mitchell prior to him coming to the Cavs. I was a little skeptical when the trade went down. Looking at his tenure in Utah, he had 1 season of career average efficiency, right? The majority of those years, the Jazz were better with him off the court than they were on the court. I do think that he has grown as a player. I've been incredibly impressed with the way that he carries himself, both on and off the court. And I'm really encouraged by his ability to continue to grow. I think that stretch with Garland and Mobley out was the best playmaking that I'd seen from him.
Yeah.
Really, really, really impressive. You know, Obviously there's a disclaimer that they went 11-3 in those games with Donovan and Jarrett. They only played 2 teams with an above 500 record. One was the Milwaukee, who was below 500 after the firing of Adrian Griffin and with an interim coach at the time, and the other one was Orlando, who we know that they're better than. They beat them in a playoff series. So maybe that had something to do with it, but I do think his playmaking took another step forward last year. And I just think that the infrastructure that the Cavs have had, like he's talked in the past about how, he benefits from playing off of a point guard, whether it was Ricky Rubio, Mike Conley, and then, Darius, he had his best individual season. They both had their best individual seasons in 22-23. So I think, you know, that muscle memory of handling that playmaking load is going to help as they stagger. I think it's also going to help as we transition to a Kenny Atkinson offense, where you're going to have a lot of guys initiating. You're going to have a lot of guys responsible for creating, and having Donovan improve as a playmaker, I think is going to fit neatly into what Kenny wants to do.
So Darius Garland had the numbers on his season ended up being mostly fine. Like when you just look at the individual numbers, but it was just a very uneven campaign. How much of is there actually there's stuff he could do better? We've talked about his finishing around the basket in the past. I also wonder if they're able to open up more space for him if that just improves. You've mentioned, I know you've been an advocate of like, well, you don't want to disinvolve him from the offense too much. Like in that playoff series, it felt like he wasn't on the ball enough. Is there any level of concern here? Or do we just talk this up to that man had his jaw wired shut? And just the physical toll that has to extract from you of probably losing weight, not being as strong, that we just need to write off whatever issues we had with him last season.
I don't think we write it off entirely because I think, when you have a kind of consistent injury history, that's something you have to factor, right? Like you have to think about that with Darius. You have to think about that with Donovan. Like Donovan's missed more games than Darius the last 4 or 5 years. Like that we have to think about that. We have to think, about guard depth because these guys are going to miss some time. But in terms of, the stuff that went wrong, like I do chalk that up, to injuries. People focus on the jaw injury, rightly so. He did have the situation with his grandmother passing as well, where he's incredibly close to his family. So after games, he would fly back home to be there with his family, then fly back to Cleveland or wherever they were playing, and then play another game, then fly back to his family and kind of do that for an extended period of time. And when you're already working your way back from an injury, that's going to be difficult. And in the long list of things that went wrong for him last year, I think people overlook what happened at the start of the year, right? He and Donovan started the year with hamstring injuries. He injured his shooting hand, I believe, in the first game back and was wearing, a brace for about a month, kind of on and off, trying to figure that out. And I think that really impacted his ability to handle the ball. Like you saw the turnovers go way up for him. You saw a reluctance to take 3-pointers because he just couldn't grip the ball. Ironically, like his stats were still fine in that stretch because he was actually finishing really well at the rim and he was drawing free throws. He just became like he was seeking out contact to such an extent to kind of compensate for the fact that he couldn't really grip the ball to shoot, that he ended up ramming his jaw into Kristaps Porzingis's hip, and things went sideways there. But that Boston injury was terrible timing because at that point the hand injury had recovered and we did get like this extended stretch of, there's the 22-8 Darius on great efficiency, not turning the ball over that we're used to, right? Like I think a lot of the Darius concern that I hear, especially from national podcasts, is like, well, he just hasn't been the same since Donovan was there. Like it just, his game has completely fallen off. And that like
We're just gonna write off that first season together, then I guess like that.
yeah, like that couldn't be further from the truth. Like he averaged, I think, 0.1 fewer points per game, but actually more per 36. He just played fewer minutes. His efficiency went way up. He across the board, his defensive metrics went through the roof. His assist to turnover ratio was second to only Nikola Jokic among like high usage players. Like this is a guy that like that was the player that we saw, and I was really expecting to see a step forward from him in a leap going into next year. When we talked to him in media day, he was talking about how he really wanted to up the volume for his 3-point attempts, which of course got sidetracked and derailed by an injury to the shooting hand. So I have some concerns because I think when you're building positive momentum and you have a setback like this, and just kind of one of these throwaway years, I think it is a challenge to get back to not only where you were before, but then, take that step forward that you were anticipating taking. That's, not something that should just be taken for granted and assume that it's going to occur. But if I had to bet, at the very least, I think we're getting Darius going back to who he was in 22, 23. I'm still, I'm emotionally, and this is probably, me being an optimist, but I think we're still going to see that step forward in the leap that we should have seen last season.